Tēnā koutou katoa. So welcome to this session on how New Zealand responds to supply chain challenges. Tava Olsen, Director of the Centre for Supply Chain Management at the University of Auckland, and I'll be moderating this session. Apologies, we have had to change platform due to technical difficulties. So since we're on Zoom, please do make sure that you mute yourself. But all the questions and answers should go through the original platform, and please type questions at any time. So we've got three panelists today. We've got Professor Anna Strutt from the University of Waikato, Harriet Shelton, who's Head of Supply Chains at the Ministry of Transport, and Alex Larson, who's Cargo Manager at Air New Zealand. So first up, gives me great pleasure to introduce Anna Strutt, who's a Professor of Economics at the University of Waikato. She's Director of Asia Programs there and is also a Global Trade Analysis Project Research Fellow at Purdue University in the US. She's a member of the Pacific Trade and Development International Steering Committee, an advisor to UNESCAP's Asia Pacific Research and Training Network on trade, and an associate editor of the Journal of Global Economic Analysis. So her research is largely in the area of international policy analysis and particularly quantitative assessments. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you very much, Tara, for that introduction. And I'm really delighted to join this panel on how New Zealand responds to supply chain challenges. It's a highly topical issue, and just as many of us have become amateur epidemiologists in recent times, the general population has become increasingly aware of the complex choreography that makes modern shopping possible. Surging demand combined with supply disruptions has highlighted potential fragilities leading to empty shelves and long wait times, with many of us concerned that Santa will be arriving late this year. So in a short presentation, I'd like to take a global view, and then I'm very much looking forward to learning from the detailed insights of my fellow panelists, as well as learning from the audience. I'll begin with an overview of the shocks or challenges that can impact global supply chains before focusing on the impact of COVID. Then I'll turn to the importance of robustness and resilience in supply chains before finishing with a few comments on future global supply chains and risks. Well, global supply chains span across multiple countries and continents to enable the sourcing and supplying of intermediate inputs, as well as final goods and services across borders, very much reflecting the global fragmentation of production these days. Challenges or shocks to these global supply chains can be due to a wide range of events, including natural disasters, climatic events, accidents, cyber disruption, conflict, terrorism, political and trade policies, as well as macroeconomic and financial shocks. So quite a wide range of shocks which can vary geographically. For example, they might be local or regional or global. And the impacts, of course, could be short-term, medium-term, or even drag out into the long term. The particular challenge that we're facing at the moment, of course, is COVID-19. While it started as a regional shock, it's transformed very much into a global shock. And while we may have initially hoped the impacts would be short-term, it isn't yet clear how COVID and the emerging variants will play out, including the impact on global supply chains. So some of you will recall being at this event last year when in early December 2020, we were approaching 70 million global COVID cases and around 1.6 million deaths worldwide. Those seemed stunning numbers at the time, but now we have more than 260 million confirmed cases and more than 5.2 million deaths globally. So it really is an unprecedented crisis that's impacted every country in the world and had a significant effect on global trade, on international trade flows. Even before COVID-19, global trade flows were in a bit of trouble. There was a low growth trend in trade after the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, along with increased trade tensions manifesting through a range of tariff and non-tariff measures. COVID-19 dealt an additional blow to the international trade system, with shocks to the global economy coming in the form of health shocks, policy shocks, demand shocks, and of course supply shocks. In the past, the supply shocks that we saw typically came from things like natural disasters, which tend to be fairly limited to specific countries or regions, But COVID has brought waves of supply shocks that are unprecedented, particularly given the complex and extensive linkages between modern economies. The early stages of the pandemic, they were marked by concerns that global supply chains, especially those with a high level of dependency on particular nodes or countries, could break down and become a new source of cascading shocks. And although there's been instances of lockdowns in one part of the world giving rise to temporary halts to assembly lines elsewhere, global supply chains have in general turned out to be remarkably resilient, indeed helping to drive economic recovery. The recently released WTO 2021 World Trade Report notes that global trade has been more resilient during the COVID pandemic than it was during the global financial crisis. So 2020 was certainly a tough year, with global output reducing by 3.3% and global trade reducing by 9.6%. But as we moved into 2021, things improved. Global output increasing by 5.3% in 2021, or that's the forecast. Thanks in large part to the robust recovery of merchandise trade, which is expected to increase by about 8% this year. Of course, the impacts differ significantly across sectors. For example, with some services sectors remaining relatively depressed, particularly industries such as tourism. So these, combination of supply and demand has led to supply chain bottlenecks and disruptions. In 2021, many firms experienced a slump and cut production, but there's been strong demand for many consumer goods, in part supported by massive fiscal relief in many countries. So there's been a sharp rebound in demand and also a shift in spending particularly from in-person services to consumer goods. So what we now face are some sizable mismatches of supply and demand, and potentially the rise of inflation, which will bring its own set of challenges to us. These supply and demand forces have combined to lead to significant pressure on global logistics and costs. For example, World Bank data suggests that monthly median global ship delays on the North American West Coast increased from about 90 hours pre-pandemic to more than 240 hours now. The proportion of ships arriving within 8 hours of their announced schedule has halved from almost 80% to less than 40%. And in terms of costs, The Economist notes the cost of shipping a box from China to the US West Coast has increased tenfold. And McKinsey estimates it costs up to 6 times more to ship a container from China to Europe than it did at the start of 2019. So significant pressure on logistics and the costs of those. I guess, we can probably draw a useful distinction between resilience and robustness in supply chains. Robustness we might think of as the ability to maintain operations during a disruption, whereas resilience can be defined as the ability to return to normal operations over a reasonable period of time. And both businesses and government have got a role to play in improving robustness and resilience in global supply chains. With the pressure of disruptions, lots of companies have been rethinking their business models, and we've seen acceleration of trends that were already emerging. So, even before COVID, supply chains were transforming, with global uncertainty highlighting that things like lean inventory, just-in-time delivery, they didn't have much provision for risk. So the trend was already moving towards shorter, faster supply chains with more diversification of suppliers and production, along with better information to reduce risk and to meet the demands of consumers wanting more information on how and where things are produced. Increased digitization, that's also been dramatically sped up by COVID, and we've all seen, I think, things that used to appear impossible from a distance suddenly become possible. Some of you will recall the work of Richard Baldwin, who presented at the first ATEPS event, emphasizing the importance of what he calls globotics, this globalization mixed with all kinds of new robotics that make it relatively easy to outsource even quite complex services jobs. So you've got AI, robotics, already changing how factories and warehouses and delivery systems work. And these, along with things like 3D printing, where you might be able to push a button in one country to print out a product in another country, these could have a big impact in the future and have been further stimulated by the travel constraints and so forth that COVID's brought. So for many businesses, there's been an increased focus on diversifying supply sources and destination markets, and also building inventory of critical inputs with more of a focus on just in case rather than just in time that we were seeing in the past. But of course, these supply chains, they're costly to business. For example, holding inventory, changing supply chain geography to reduce current levels of interdependence. This can lead to new sets of vulnerability. So it's a challenging environment. In terms of the government, it's not just businesses, but government also has a role to play in improving the resilience and robustness of supply chains. But the government involvement also comes with some risks, potentially disrupting market signals, leading to inefficient industries dependent on state handouts, as well as a long-term burden on taxpayers. So while short-term policies like financial assistance and policies to keep those supply chains moving have been much needed in New Zealand and other countries, it's really important to focus on improvements in policy areas that will help in the long term as well as now. And in particular, we need to focus on keeping those international markets open, ensuring rules, regulations support international trade flows, and trade agreements will help, including making progress in areas like non-tariff barriers to trade and cooperation over key international supply chain issues. So, rethinking of global supply chains is entirely appropriate. Pandemic-related responses have prompted calls in some countries, however, to reshore and unwind trade integration. And while some changes to supply chains are appropriate, this is probably not the direction to go in. It might be tempting for businesses and governments to focus inward, but it will bring its own set of problems. Furthermore, an inward focus by economists will weaken recovery prospects, making solving global problems harder. And we've got plenty of global problems at the moment, including getting access to these vaccines, medical equipment, and so on, that we very much need the supply chains for. So just to wrap up, looking to the future, we've got ongoing risks from COVID, including disruptions being exacerbated by the recovery of demand, leading to inflation and the consequent policy responses like increases in interest rates that will impact the economy. But the potential evolution of the pandemic also presents an ongoing and significant risk to world trade and global supply chains, particularly if we see more serious variants emerging. So we need to focus on this robustness and resilience of supply chains and continue to really focus on these sorts of areas. So in closing, we remain living in really interesting times, and I'd like to pass back to Tara. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. And just a reminder to all participants to please put your questions and answers in the platform, and also keep yourself on mute since we've had to go with the Zoom platform. So let me introduce our next panelist, who is Harriet Shelton. Harriet has worked in transportation planning and policy for almost 25 years, mostly within local government, and she's recently made the move to central government. She spent 6 years as Principal Planning at Transport for London, advising the Mayor of London on the strategic transport implications of major urban development and planning policy proposals. Since returning to New Zealand in 2012, Harriet's work is focused on strategic policy advice and collaboration in transport, urban planning and infrastructure. And in her current role at the Ministry of Transport, Harriet leads a policy team focusing on strategic freight and supply chain issues spanning rail, road, and ports and shipping. Welcome, Harriet.
A little trouble unmuting myself. So Anna has done a really great job of setting the scene for the situation we find ourselves in with regards to supply chain disruption. So I won't cover much of that material, otherwise I'd just be repeating Anna's excellent summary. So I'm going to focus mainly on government's role, particularly the Ministry of Transport role. So we became aware of these disruptions around about August 2020. I think it's fair to say it took us by surprise, and I think it probably took quite a lot of people in the industry by surprise. Everyone had been expecting a recession, and in fact the opposite happened. Demand skyrocketed at a time when capacity was limited within many parts of the supply chains. So government's role in this has been one of a bird's eye view. So we have been looking down across the entire system and building the picture of what's going on by working with industry players, and of which there are many. And really working on a very regular engagement regime where we engage on almost a weekly basis with many of these participants in the supply chain. So that may be ports, shipping lines, freight forwarders, trucking firms, etc., etc. And what we find is that there is a range of views as to why these issues are occurring and what can be done to solve them. So government's role in resolving some of these issues is actually quite limited. This is a market-driven system. This is a system that is managed best at an operational level by those operators who know their business the best. And government will never be able to be in that space. We just don't. We don't work at an operational level. We are looking at policy issues and policy solutions. So what we can do is to try and bring some of those players together to try and coordinate some of the different perspectives and the different roles that each of these players actually have. And help them to find solutions by helping them to work better together. That can be sometimes quite difficult in what is a very competitive market, a very competitive sector, and that competition needs to stay. That's what we need. But we also recognise, and I think all the participants recognise, that actually some coordination and cooperation can really help at a time like this. Government's role can also be to collect information and provide information across the board about what is actually going on, to help businesses plan better, to be able to forecast, to have a better understanding of what's actually going on around them. That has actually been more difficult than we expected as well. It's an extremely complex system, and there are some commercial sensitivities which make it difficult for businesses to share the data that they have. So we are continuing to work on this, and we've run, just in the last couple of weeks, we've actually run a series of workshops specifically focused on data. This has been something that's been identified by many stakeholders as affecting their ability to be adaptable and to respond to the challenges that they face. So what we've been doing is unpicking these issues that they've raised to try and understand what exactly is the market not doing in a way that government could help. And that work will continue into next year. We have had some more broad level stakeholder workshops earlier this year, where we brought participants together to build a better understanding of what were the issues for them and what some possible solutions could be. There are really no silver bullets, of course, and a lot of the response at the moment for the short term really needs to be about adapting to the new normal. What we do believe is that things will never go back to exactly the way they were prior to 2020. Freight costs may come down, but they may not necessarily ever go back to being as low as they were before. And there'll be all sorts of other factors that are probably going to stay in an unstable situation, for example, geopolitical issues and so on. So what we think our short-term response really needs to be for New Zealand is about alleviating rather than eliminating the disruption. And what we're faced with is a very lean and efficient supply chain system. So the supply chains all over the world, but particularly for New Zealand, are optimised for efficiency. That means that they are not always well placed to cope with shocks and instability. And so we will need to work together to find out how we can get the system to be more resilient and more adaptable in a way that doesn't create excess inefficient capacity and redundancy in the system. In terms of government's work, our levers are more medium to long term. That's what we really do best. And so we are working on, we've begun work on a national freight and supply chain strategy. And really the main purpose of this strategy is to ensure that supply chains are better positioned for the future. Because we know that we will be in an increasingly volatile and uncertain and complex world, and supply chains are no exception to that. New Zealand also faces some particular challenges because of where we're located. We're a long distance from markets. We're at the end of the road. We are quite adversely affected, perhaps more than other countries in the Northern Hemisphere that may have more options available to them with regards to transporting their goods around. We are at the mercy of some very large global shipping lines. We don't have very much ability to influence a lot of the global issues because of the size of our country and our position in the world. So the best thing we can do is to join together with others. And we're working quite closely with Australia for that very reason. So in terms of our supply chain strategy, we've been doing some very targeted engagement over the last 3 months, and we've engaged with over 200 different stakeholders. We've held workshops and interviews, and we'll be continuing to do that into the next year. We're also building a picture of what we think is on the horizon, what we know are going to be some big issues that our supply chains will need to respond to. One of the biggest is climate change. That's not just about our own climate change policy and our policies that we will need to place on decarbonising the transport system, but that will also affect what our producers actually produce and where, and what will be produced in other countries and what will change in terms of what they import and export. There may be some other policies that will be introduced by other countries that would affect our own exporters and importers. For example, will there still be a consumer demand for apples from New Zealand, for example, when they may be encouraged to buy locally? Carbon taxes and other kinds of carbon change mitigations introduced around the world are almost certainly going to increase costs for operators. We need to be aware of other climate change impacts, such as sea level rise and impacts on infrastructure, particularly for ports, but also for road and rail as well. Those are just some of the climate change mitigations. There are also all sorts of other trends that we're going to be needing to respond to, which could be automation, other kinds of technology, digitization, global shipping trends such as the larger ships, population growth. What does that mean for New Zealand, and how does that change our patterns of consumption and production? All of those will have impacts on the supply chain system. So what we're going to be working on over the next 18 months and beyond is to build an integrated system, an integrated picture of the system, a shared view. This has to be done in partnership. This is not going to be a government-only exercise. And what we want to ultimately produce is something that gives greater clarity on what our priorities need to be as government and also as sector, where the investment needs to go, and really overall supporting greater awareness amongst both the public and the sector and government about the role that freight and supply chains need to play. We are working on an issues paper at the moment, which we'll be consulting on early next year. And then we will be working on some deeper dives into particular topic areas such as resilience, decarbonisation, productivity, and many, many more. And we will hope to have a draft framework of a strategy by the end of 2022. So I'd encourage, for those of you not already involved, I'd encourage those of you to get in touch with us. We have a page on our website about the strategy, and we're keen to get as broad a cross-section of views as possible, because that is one thing we're aware of. There's a lot of different views out there. And so that is where we're coming from, Ministry of Transport. Look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Harriet. And a reminder to put questions into the platform. So our final panelist is Alex Larson, who is the Global Sales Manager for Air New Zealand's cargo business and leads a number of regional teams based across Asia, the Americas and Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. Alex has been deeply involved in Air New Zealand's cargo response to the COVID-19 pandemic, including the setup of the original cargo-only operating model in March 2020. So that must have been pretty prompt that you had to do that. So prior to this, Alex led the New Zealand and Pacific Islands region for Air New Zealand Cargo, and he is an alumnus of the University of Auckland holding an MBA with us. Welcome.
Thanks, Tava, much appreciated. I'll just share my screen quickly and kick straight in. And Tava, if you wouldn't mind just giving me a thumbs up, hopefully you can see a presentation screen. Fantastic.
We could see it okay.
Just try again. It wasn't going into presenter mode for some reason. Okay. Nothing like a run of technical difficulties.
Yeah, I mean, if it doesn't go, maybe just click through, because we can see the slides, even though they're a bit busy on the sides.
Gotcha. Can you still see them at the moment?
No.
Okay. Well, we might have to run without. I'm not sure quite what's happening there. And I know that we're time bound as well. So we'll see how things go, and I'll try and do my best to be as descriptive as I can as with regards to what should have been on the screen. So my apologies in advance there. But kia ora koutou, and thanks for having me first of all. The first thing that I wanted to do was actually just to reframe the statement here, which is how New Zealand responds to supply chain challenges, which is pretty matter of fact and reasonably absolute. And to reframe that to a question, which is, how does New Zealand, the collective New Zealand, all of us, respond to supply chain challenges? And the reason being, I believe in earnest, we're still trying to answer this question. That said, I think we have part of the answer, and that our experiences of the past 18 months have offered some insight into what we need to carry forward with us if we're to respond to future supply chain challenges well. So the first thing I thought I'd do is give a quick overview of the role that airlines play within the context of the New Zealand supply chain. In terms of the total volume of goods moved, air freight represents about 1%, actually less than. In New Zealand, about 0.3% of the total volume of goods moved. But when we look to the total value of trade, about 16% of total export value and 22% of total import value is enabled through air freight. The last point to note is that tourism and trade are inextricably linked, and yes, they are both significant contributors to New Zealand's economy, but also as a result of buoyant tourism, we create additional air freight capacity for our importers and exporters. And around 80% of New Zealand's air freight is traditionally carried in the belly of passenger aircraft. So simply speaking, buoyant tourism improves the breadth of market access and, relatively speaking, reduces the total cost of market access for those trading internationally. And this was the case particularly in the 5 to 10 years leading up to 2019. If you imagine a chart growing exponentially over time, we saw incredible growth in international visitor arrivals up until 2019, and then it drops off a cliff and a sheer drop at that. COVID-19 is a supply chain challenge unlike any other, and I know the previous presenters have noted this. To give some sense, the previous outbreaks we've faced, so SARS and MERS, generally hit the aviation industry in the space of a few months, and then things recovered back to pre-outbreak levels within around 6 months. Other events which hit global aviation and things like the financial crises and 9/11 generally lasted 6 to 18 months, but really only impacted things in the range of about 10%, 5 to 20% actually. So it's the order of magnitude, this 95% reduction in passenger flying, and it's a stark visual depiction, if you can imagine, this drop of 95% where everything else remains at about 10, combined with the longevity, so 18 months and running, which makes COVID-19 a challenge like no other. So to move this forward, I'd like to share a few insights as to how to date we have responded to the challenges of COVID-19, as it's as good a challenge as any we've seen within supply chains. And I'd also like to note that as much as this is Air New Zealand's cargo story, it's also the story about the other stakeholders within the New Zealand value chain that we operate alongside, but I'll get to that. So going back a little bit, the 2nd of February 2020, following the announcement from the New Zealand government on the China travel restrictions, we suspended our Auckland-Shanghai services immediately. From there, passenger cargo services continued to decline as the situation worsened from around 900 long-haul departures within an average month down to less than 100. In that same period, in response to this, within about 48 hours, while I might add some people were working from coffee tables and the likes, we built a cargo-only charter proposition and took it to market globally with immediate uptake. At one point, we were operating double daily cargo services back to Shanghai, 14 services a week, where previously that had been reduced to 0. Bringing in PPE into New Zealand as part of our pandemic response and allowing exporters to maintain their market presence. And it's worth noting that cargo-only flying now is still the mainstay of Air New Zealand's international network, operating somewhere between 400 to 500 rotations every month, cargo-only without passengers. This all might sound simple in hindsight, but in reality, the wholesale change required to make this work was considerable. Notably, the change in cost of operating as cargo only and the flow-on impact on the cost of market access for shippers. And in the same breath, moving from operating a passenger-led network where cargo capacity is made available as a result to a model where we would require leading indicators from customers as to what future demand would look like so that we might right-size the amount of cargo-only capacity available, then operationalize it. So the flying rights, the slot times, pilots, ground crew, sort of the list goes on. And I might add, all of this at a time where at any one point there was no real surety as to what the next week ahead would hold, let alone how much demand there would be in 3 months' time, and supply chains were being disrupted left, right, and centre. And if you were to look for a silver lining, therein lies the opportunity, which is to achieve some continuity of supply at a time when others are unable to. So there's no question that every one of us has been looking into our crystal balls to try and figure out what the future holds. We probably still are, so that we might plan the perfect strategy and execute it, which is a particularly common way of working for all of us, no doubt. But when the future's uncertain at best, and planning and executing a singular long-term strategy is riddled with risk, and planning for all eventualities is loaded with redundancy and effort and resource, I liken the experience of our last 18 months to driving in the fog. And just imagine you are heading down the central plateau with trees on either side for the first time with fog in front of you in the dark. At any one time, you can only see the next 100 meters that's in front of you. And for navigating that stretch of road, the next 100 meters becomes visible, and the next 100 meters and so forth. But at any moment in time beyond the immediate 100 meters in front of you, it's really anyone's guess as to which way the road turns. And so I noted earlier that as much as this is Air New Zealand's cargo story, it's also the story of the other stakeholders within the New Zealand value chain that we operate alongside. And it's how we've reshaped our ways of working, this driving through the fog way of working, which has allowed us collectively to build some resilience into the supply chain in the face of the challenges COVID-19 has served us. So to this point, I would like to offer a framework which is representative, at least, of our experiences of the last 18 months. And within this framework, which I would ordinarily be showing you on the screen, there are 5 points to it, flowing in a continuous cycle. The first point here is that when you're navigating uncertainty, you're at your most vulnerable. We certainly were and still are to some extent. Trust was critical. Collaboration was critical, and having these sorts of existing partnerships already in place was key. Without trust, things stalled almost immediately and conversations stopped. The second point flowing through is networked value chain stakeholders, not linear one-to-one-to-one relationships. And what I mean by this is communication grows exponentially within networks compared to with linear relationships. And we saw that play out in networked conversations across shippers, freight forwarders, a number of agencies involved with NZ Inc., such as the Ministry of Transport, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, MFAT. And what this meant to the third point is that the flow of leading information was exponentially stronger than going alone, which allowed us all to understand better the next 100 meters of road that was ahead of us and drive forward together. It's then the co-development of new operating models, not relying on the traditional models to get you through the challenge or the crisis. So for us, that was cargo-only charters, it was the International Air Freight Capacity Scheme, IFC, and now MIAC, which are deeply complex and heavily involved new operating models. But they were fit for the road that we could see ahead. They were developed at pace and deployed at pace as well. And I can't understate how important the cross-collaboration between shippers, freight forwarders, the Ministry of Transport and other government agencies has been and remains so. The fifth point is that the participants here also acknowledged that the current operating models may only be fit for the next few hundred meters ahead. Thereafter, we may need to change again, and as such, the ability to unlearn one way of operating and develop new ways of working suitable to the next 100 meters in short succession was critical. And finally, it's through those new ways of working that delivered beneficial outcomes for the network of value chain stakeholders that we instill greater trust, and so the cycle repeats. So now when I look to answer that question, how does New Zealand respond to supply chain challenges? Part of the answer is about building resilience through responsive ways of working. Our experiences of the last 18 months suggest that it's important that we consider future supply chains as networked ecosystems built on trust, collaboration, and partnership, rather than a series of transactional arm's length relationships. And it's only through the interconnectedness of that network that the collective competencies of all value chain stakeholders can be recombined and scaled as required in response to each supply chain challenge. So in short, this is about networked competencies versus individual core competencies. And the faster the cycle time that these competencies can be reconfigured, i.e. the collective agility and malleability of the stakeholders, the more resilience is inherently built into the system. We certainly experienced that over the last 18 months. So in closing, to summarize, if yesterday's supply chains were one-dimensional and set in stone, and if we are to respond to future challenges well, tomorrow's supply chains will need to be interconnected and responsive to freely flowing leading information, working as a coordinated set of competencies as opposed to individuals. Kia ora and thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We only have 5 minutes left, but I'd like to pick up a question that's all of you have mentioned, supply chain resilience and robustness. And of course, lean supply chains, by definition, drive out the waste, are not resilient or robust, and increasing resilience and robustness will add cost, at least in the short term. So how do we help companies think through taking a longer term perspective around resilience and robustness? And is there a role for government to play in that space, or do we just let the market act if people are not taking that long term perspective? So Anna, let me start with you on that question.
Thanks, Tara. It's a really interesting question, and I'm going to be curious to hear, including Alex, your industry response on this. Has the government got a role to play? Well, I think absolutely, and Harriet will probably have more to say on this. I think the government's absolutely got a role to play, but we've got to be careful not to overstate the role of the government, because what we've seen in the pandemic is government's getting pretty heavy-handed in a lot of different areas. And there's no argument that it's been well needed, but a lot of things that we've been cautious about in the past, governments getting involved in making decisions that really governments haven't necessarily got the best foresight about, can be dangerous territory for us. So that was, I guess, one of the cautions I made in my comments, that we've got to make sure that the government is supporting business and so on, and not driving inefficiency in future business. I think perhaps some of the really important things businesses can do, and again, I'm interested in Harriet's and Alex's view, but are things like helping with developing skills in accessing data, infrastructure to support data needs, these sorts of things. Important in countries like New Zealand, but a lot of my own work is in developing countries. And I think really to see the last of this pandemic, if we do, we need to make sure that the developing countries also have access to these supply chains for the medical needs that they have and so on. They also are future markets. So I think infrastructure, data, these sorts of things, supporting businesses and making sure that governments don't get too heavy-handed in making decisions that should be made by businesses. Thanks.
Thanks, Harriet. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo what Anna's just said. The last thing that we want to do is to intervene in a sector that doesn't really benefit from centralised planning. And even if we did do that, we'd probably pick the wrong winners and losers. So what our responsibility should be is about creating the conditions that enable businesses to make the right decisions, and for that natural competition and decision making to actually occur. That isn't really probably happening at the moment because of some of the regulatory settings, particularly across the ports, where there is a mix of public and private ownership, but not necessarily set up in a way that encourages natural competition and natural responsiveness to actually occur. The regional councils on the whole are owners in each of those ports. One of the things that government can do is, and again, that was already alluded to, is that we can help to provide a platform for that data to be provided that enables those businesses to be able to make decisions. And so we can provide some modelling, we can look at scenarios, we can look at forecasts and long-term trends, and work with our counterparts around the world to build that understanding that enables businesses to hopefully make better planning decisions. The other thing that we're doing is we're working with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise and the likes of Business New Zealand, Export New Zealand and so on, who work with their customers and their members to build capability, whether that's through webinars or one-to-one advice. There's quite a lot of work going on in that space just to give the tools available to actually be able to make those better decisions. So what government wants to be able to do is to get out of the way wherever possible if our regulatory settings are actually causing problems for businesses that prevent them from being more resilient. And that's what we're going to be exploring next year.
Thanks. So we've been given permission to go 2 minutes over, but participants need to go straight to the next session after we're done. So we do have time for Alex to address it, and actually maybe also around the question how Air New Zealand thinks through the trade-off between lean versus resilience.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and to give a short answer, I think context is always king in these instances. I think lean is incredibly desirable for most people doing international trade and also operating businesses, but it's best suited, I think, in periods of extended stability. And I think there is an underlying question here as to what extent will volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity remain a common place of the market moving forward. And it might be that a small move from a polar end of a spectrum being entirely lean and making small trade-offs could be incredibly valuable to build more resilience into the system. That said, there will always be parts of the markets which are built on stable foundations, and lean can be pursued, no doubt. I touched on a concept before, and I think this perhaps relates to Air New Zealand's response as well, but it's about having lean organisations built around a central set of core competencies, and that allows you to operate in an efficient manner. But it's through the networking of close and trusted partners that you build out a more comprehensive set of networked capabilities that you can draw upon. And the key piece is that you can reconfigure those as required to the market condition. It is a little bit cumbersome, and it certainly in our experience was driven through people engagements. But I think there's no question over time that technology will continue to improve the efficiencies and delivery of that way of working. And one might hope that the efficiencies through technology might offset their incremental costs of not operating in such a lean fashion as you were previously.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I would like to thank all our panelists and remind participants to go over to the next session. It's been really good. Thank you very much.